Good afternoon. Um, the current war in the Middle East leaves nobody unmoved, and after it started in October, this new war, this new conflict, we promised each other that we would have a discussion here in our class, and but at that moment I couldn't, or we couldn't, never hoped for a better speaker as the one sitting here before you, Professor. Professor Jamie Shea is very well known, I can testify, to all practitioners of security and defense policy in our transatlantic area and way beyond. He has been a high civil servant, I can say, for 38 years in the international staff of NATO. Among others, he was Deputy Assistant Secretary General for emerging security challenges. He was a strong NATO spokesperson, and I think I can remember still when was it? The spring, March 1999, when in Kosovo the NATO actions started. You were a bit the face of NATO and the voice of NATO in the media. You were a strong analyst, and you still are, a strong policy planner in the private office, among others, of the NATO Secretary General, and so many other very distinguished functions. Professor Shea is a regular writer, so he exists. Once I was told that in order to exist, you have to write. And he's a lecturer, a conference speaker, very regular conference speaker. He's associated with several universities and many think tanks. Today he will speak to us about the challenges of the Middle East and also highlight the transatlantic dimension. After the lecture and the initial remarks, we will have our Q&A. I suggest we go on in one stretch, so we'll do it in one go and see when we end. So please, let's all welcome Professor Jamie Shea.
Thank you. Dear Ambassador, dear Dirk, thank you very much for that gracious introduction. The older I get, the least I deserve it, but the more I need to hear it. So thank you. Many thanks for inviting me here to Leuven today. I tend to be invited to Leuven sort of every 10 years, which makes me a bit nervous, because if I'm invited back after 10 years, it means that they've probably forgotten just how bad my performance was on the previous occasion, and taking another risk. But it's good to be here. The Middle East is obviously a topic, particularly today, that has always raised the emotions. Both sides believe that they have God, justice, the right on their side. It's often difficult with all of us, given the emotions that are generated, to sort of step back and try to look at the situation objectively, particularly today when, of course, we see this calamitous situation in Gaza. I fully recognize that. So I want to say to the outset that I don't expect you to agree with everything I'm going to say. As Dirk said, my job now is to be an analyst and a commentator, and if you do that, you have to have your opinions. You have to sort of try to make those opinions as justified, as legitimate as you can, but you also have to understand what's going on. So what I want to do today is to try to sort of take you through my understanding of what the basic issues are, to describe the basic issues, not to sort of give you my particular sort of political beliefs or ideology on the conflict, but simply to try to show just how complicated, if you're a diplomat trying to deal with the situation at the moment, these issues are, particularly given the very contrasting positions of either side. When I've finished, you'll either agree with me or disagree with me. I'm British, as you probably guessed already, although I have a Belgian citizenship as well, which I'm very proud of, by the way. But being a British, I'm a great devotee of Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France. You know Burke, he was 18th century politician and liberal philosopher. And he sent his book to William Pitt the Younger, who was Prime Minister of the UK at the time. And Pitt sent it back saying, "Thank you, dear Edmund. It's a rhapsody in which there is much to be admired, but absolutely nothing to agree with." And having listened to me, you may also think that this is a rhapsody where you disagree, but that's fine. Hopefully, if I give you my sort of analysis of the situation, and I'm going to try also to draw some of the more geopolitical long-term implications and repercussions for international diplomacy, it will help you hopefully to clarify your own thinking, or at least why you think the way you do. So I just want to put this kind of, on cigarettes, they have this health warning. I just want to put this health warning on my presentation from the outset. I know that this raises passions, but please listen to me, disagree with me afterwards, and let's have a good, constructive dialogue on this. Right, I don't know if, like me, you love the Godfather movies by Francis Ford Coppola, and there's this scene in Godfather 2, which you must have seen, where Michael Corleone, the mafia boss who didn't really want to be in the mafia, suddenly says, every time I try to leave the mafia, it grabs me by the throat and drags me back in. And I think for my starting point is for many Western policymakers, that's probably the way they feel about the Middle East. This conflict, which has been ongoing since before 1948 and the creation of the State of Israel, but really goes back to the British mandate in Palestine in the 1920s and the 30s. This conflict has been going on for so long, has become so intractable, both sides are seeking goals which are so unacceptable to the other side, with so little common ground in the middle, that many policymakers have sort of given up on it. Yes, you can make peace in Northern Ireland. Yes, maybe you can make peace in Cyprus. Yes, you can get Macedonia to agree to a name with Greece. You can make progress elsewhere, but the Middle East conflict is the kind of archetypal, non-solvable conflict. I don't personally believe that. I think that, like any conflict, there are solutions, but there is a tendency, with so much else going on in the world, to say if we can park the Middle East somewhere in outer space and simply have the status quo, and we don't have to deal with it, so much the better. Now, if you, for example, take the administration of Joe Biden, Biden, was in the Senate for 20 years, chair of the Foreign Relations Committee for many of those years. He knows the world very well. But you saw when Biden came in a sense that, there are basic issues which I'm simply not going to try to waste my time and energy solving. I'm going to withdraw from Afghanistan, even though it leaves a mess behind. I'm going to stop the endless wars. And I'm not going to do what Bill Clinton did, or George W. Bush, or so many of my predecessors, spend all my time and effort trying to get the Palestinians and the Israelis to negotiate. Yes, we've had false starts. We've had, for example, Camp David. We've had the Oslo Accords, which were mediated by the Norwegians. We've had Y Plantation, Bill Clinton. But none of these have delivered that peace that we hoped they would. We've fallen back into the same old confrontation. So I'm not going to bother with it. If I can, I'm going to deal with Ukraine. I'm going to deal with China, the strategic competition, the technology competition with China, greening the American economy, and I'm not going to deal with the Middle East. And for some period of time, I think Dirk may disagree with me as a diplomat, like me, a former diplomat, but I think in Western sort of diplomatic circles, there was this sense, well, we can park the Middle East. Number one, the United States forged the so-called Abraham Accords. You've all heard of those, where the United States managed to persuade 4 Arab countries to normalize their diplomatic relations with Israel. Bahrain, the UAE, Morocco, and Sudan. And on the eve of the Hamas attacks against Israel on October the 7th, the Americans were hoping that the Saudis would sign up as the 5th member of the Abraham Accords. And for the United States, this was very significant because the Arab states had always said, we don't normalize our relations with Israel. This had been the stance, for example, of Kuwait for many, many, many years, unless there is a durable progress towards a two-state solution. But the Abraham Accords suggested that the Israelis could have their cake and eat it too, that they could basically keep the Palestinian issue on hold, while Israeli tourists took flights to Dubai and Abu Dhabi and so on, and commercial relations and diplomatic relations opened up with the Abraham Accords. The second thing is that progress in the Arab world seemed to carry on regardless of the situation of the Palestinians. For example, Qatar, which had been the outlaw in the Gulf Cooperation Council for many years because of its support for the Muslim Brotherhood. For example, particularly the regime of Mohamed Morsi in Egypt before the military coup d'etat of General Sisi. Qatar had been a bit of an outlaw in the region, but again, before October the 7th, Qatar and the Saudis and the others had made their peace and brought Qatar back into the fold. We had the end of the war in Syria. And now, don't get me wrong, the end of the war in Syria is not a triumph of Western diplomacy, far from it. And of course, Assad stays in power. But Assad now is frequentable again. Many countries have reopened their embassies in Damascus. And so the burning issue of the Syrian conflict and Western intervention, you remember at one stage, Obama was all set to intervene in Syria after Assad used chemical weapons. That had gone on the back burner. The Saudis had made a relative peace with Yemen, particularly in terms of stopping their intervention, which had been completely catastrophic and counterproductive for them. The UAE pulled out before Saudi from Yemen, but at least they're negotiating a ceasefire with the Iranian-backed Houthis as well. And despite the paralysis in the Arab-Israeli dispute regarding the status of the Palestinians, the region itself seemed to be progressing. I mean, all of you I know will read from page cover to cover The Economist every week. Of course you do. I didn't even have to ask you that question. And you will therefore recall just a couple of weeks ago, The Economist had this front page saying the new Middle East, where it was looking at the way in which, not regarding the old age Middle East peace process being stagnant, the Arab countries were sort of moving into modernity. Here we get Prince Salman in Saudi Arabia allowing women to drive cars, creating some limited degree of political consultation. Let's not exaggerate. Building sort of new high-tech cities called Noom, 1 kilometer long cigar tubes in the desert to show the new face of Saudi technology. The UAE, which has become a kind of regional superpower, hosting the COP28 at the end of this week, holding today a big financial conference in London, launching a space mission to Mars. Yes, the United Arab Emirates. I could go on, but this idea that the Gulf states were sort of basically deciding that it's not about religion, it's about economics. As Bill Clinton would have said, it's the economy is stupid, and moving on as well. And the United States also improving its relations with the Saudis after a testing time. And so there was a sort of sense that the region is no longer waiting for the Arab-Palestinian Israeli conflict to be resolved. The region's just going to sort of get on and do its own business and make its own alliances and forge its own relationships. The Arabs are just as uninterested as Israel in solving this particular issue. Also, I'm just giving you perceptions here so that you understand a little bit how we got into the situation that we're in today. There was also a sense that when you looked at the dynamics of the Middle East peace process, we'd run out of ideas, of inspiration as to how to sort of get the whole process started again. On the one hand, as all of you know, Israel has very much gone to the political right in recent years with the rise of the Jewish Orthodox parties. Some of them are very extremist. In fact, one such minister actually advocated using a nuclear weapon against Hamas just a couple of weeks ago, which I think, morality aside, would have been, at least from a military point of view, rather counterproductive in a tiny place like Gaza, which is the size of the Isle of Wight, if any of you are familiar with that wonderful piece of UK territory called the Isle of Wight, even if 2.3 people are bottled up inside it. But the growing sort of dependency of Likud, the traditional right-wing party, on increasingly religious parties, far-right parties, particularly parties that advocate annexation of more territory on the West Bank and the expansion of the settlements on the West Bank. This has made it very difficult to find a consensus in Israel to move forward on the Palestinian issue. The right-wing parties, because of their support for the settlers, obviously take a very extreme view of Israel's right to annex these settlements progressively. There are 200,000 of these settlers who now live on the West Bank, and clearly that was also increasing tension with the Palestinians as well. In fact, long before October the 7th, the Israelis had already got themselves into trouble as the settlers, who were very well armed. They have military-style machine guns and weapons and so on. They were taking the law into their own hands, particularly in getting involved in more clashes. This was creating unrest in Jenin, which is the hotbed of the Palestinian resistance on the West Bank. The Israeli army was therefore called on by the settlers to deploy more and more of its forces on the West Bank to deal with the prospects of a new intifada, a Palestinian uprising breaking out. And that's one of the reasons why Hamas found it so easy to break into Israel on October the 7th, because the Israelis, thinking that Hamas wasn't going to do anything, had sort of taken a calculated gamble of moving the bulk of their forces into the West Bank, particularly around the Jenin refugee camp, where they thought most of the problems were going to occur. So we have Israel becoming a more divided society. You saw that, of course, with the big protests against the reform of the Supreme Court and the role of the judiciary, enormous demonstrations in Israel. In fact, many serving officers in the Israeli intelligence service and the Israeli army, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, said that they would not serve the government. They were in open mutiny over the reform of the judiciary, and the calculation of Hamas was undoubtedly influenced by the deployment of the IDF towards the West Bank, leaving the border with Gaza undefended, and by a perception that Israel was so convulsed with this internal turbulence over the reform of the judiciary that this was probably the right time to hit a country which was increasingly vulnerable. The other thing, from an Israeli point of view, to explain the paralysis is that, well, who do we negotiate with? Hamas, no. It's Iranian-sponsored, it's committed in its constitution, going way back to the 1980s when it was first formed, 1986, to the disruption of the Jewish state. It's never deviated from that. We've got the alternative, which is the Palestinian Authority, remember, which came out of the old Yasser Arafat-dominated Palestinian Liberation Organization that used to hijack planes. You're too young to remember this, but Dirk and I remember it. Back in the 70s and 80s, remember, attacked the Israeli Olympic team in Munich in 1972 and so on. But the Palestinian Authority had been given a high degree of autonomy, for example, its own police force, a degree of local control on the West Bank. But it's been increasingly perceived as corrupt. It doesn't have the support of many Palestinians. Mahmoud Abbas, who is the leader, should have put himself up for election 8 years ago, but has not done so. And so the Israelis felt, well, as far as delivering the Palestinians, we can't obviously talk to Hamas, but the PA is not a reliable partner either. So with whom do we make peace? I mentioned already the declining pressure of the Arabs on both sides to get them to the negotiating table. And also in Israel, finally, a sort of perception that we don't need to solve this. Guys, gals, if you've got a problem in life, you either solve it or you decide too complicated to solve. I'm just going to live with it. And in Israel, there was a perception that they could avoid, the two things that they both sort of really rejected. The one-state solution, because the one-state solution means giving rights to the Palestinians, which means Israel no longer is a Jewish state, because the Palestinians will have the majority. It's rather like South Africa, where you would have immediately a black majority rule situation. Although the Israelis have given a large degree of voting rights to the Arab minority that lives in Israel, becoming increasingly vocal. In fact, some Arab Israelis participate in the government. The two-state solution, equally unacceptable, because it means the Israelis have to give up a lot of land. They're not certain that a Palestinian state is compatible with their security. The Palestinians won't want to accept a kind of Bantustan to carry on with the South African model state, where they have no real sovereignty. Israel controls the borders, the airspace, has an army perpetually stationed there. That's not an independent state. So the Israelis decided we can live between the one state and the two-state solution. and we can have a total security concept. Any of you who have visited the region, I've been there many times, and I'm not a Middle East expert, Dirk, but I'm going to pretend to be one today. But as you know, I deal more with NATO and Ukraine. But I've been to the Middle East, and those who've been there would have seen the wall, the Israelis have built, around the West Bank area, the watchtowers, all of the checkpoints that you have. The Israelis have built separate roads that only Israeli registered cars can travel along, and Palestinian green, Israeli yellow number plate, Palestinian green number plate, they can't travel along. So they've sort of come up with a solution of, I could sort of, like the little Dutch boy in the story who keeps his finger in the hole in the dike. I could just sort of keep there with my finger in the hole in the dike indefinitely, and I'll just sort of wait out the problem, in a way, wait for better days. Meanwhile, Israeli economy is booming. 1 million Russians, many oligarchs, pro-Putin oligarchs, go to live in Israel, own a lot of the media, own football teams and so on. Israel's high-tech sector, its cyber companies are some of the most notorious as well as the most successful in the world. The population is growing relatively well. Okay, we can sort of basically create the total security situation. We deal with the security as a substitute for dealing with the politics. It's not pretty comfortable, but it's preferable to all of the risks and uncertainties of negotiating with the Palestinians. Now, of course, the problem here is that the status quo the more the status quo becomes acceptable for the Israelis, the less the status quo becomes acceptable for the Palestinians. If you're a Palestinian, you're in this kind of terrible dilemma that in 1948 you're offered 48% of traditional Palestine by the United Nations in the partition agreement. And you refuse it because 48% does not give you a majority. And every year you come back and the Israelis say, well, 48% is not on the table any longer. It's now 20%. And they come back and say, well, it's not 20% any longer because now we've expanded on the settlements. So, we'll take nice agricultural land on the West Bank and we may compensate you with some desert elsewhere in southern Israel. It may be the same number of square kilometers, but it's not the same economic value. Or why don't you go off and Dirk and I were talking about this, do a marriage with the Jordanians in some kind of confederation, as many Palestinians went after 1948 to Jordan. So the problem is that every time the Palestinians come back, it's for less and less for what they were once offered. And of course that makes the negotiation even more unacceptable because it means very, very painful compromises each time. So the more the status quo becomes acceptable for one party, the less the status quo is acceptable to the other. The events of October the 7th have demonstrated that all of this is an illusion. You can keep the problem on hold. It's not going to explode. You can manage the crises as they come along and keep them at an acceptable cost. Somehow the other side is going to get used to it and increasingly live with it, in a quiescent way. The October the 7th, of course, is traumatic for the Israelis. It's their 9/11. Proportionally speaking, they lost far more people than the United States did when attacked by Al-Qaeda in New York and Washington on 9/11. And I'm going to try to be as objective as I possibly can. Not easy, but I'm going to try. From an Israeli perspective, it's traumatic because, number one, they didn't see it coming, and they've prided themselves always, on the brilliance of their intelligence services. I mean, a little place like the Gaza Strip, you've got Mossad, you've got Shin Bet, you've got their super intelligence agencies, they've penetrated Hamas, they've got informers everywhere, they've got electronic sensors, they control the airspace. How could they not see that this whole plot was being prepared? This is traumatic for the Israelis, who've always believed that their security service is so good that will always sort of protect them and keep them out of trouble. Secondly, it's a crisis of assumptions, not just of intelligence, but assumptions. The idea was that Hamas is pledged to the destruction of Israel, but Hamas has an interest in keeping the status quo going. It controls Gaza. It's kicked out the Palestinian Authority in 2006 after the Israelis withdrew from Gaza in 2005. you know, we allow 10,000 Gazans to come across the border and work in Israel every day. We allow the food trucks to go in, the humanitarian supplies. Israel provides the electricity. Hamas have got no reason to disrupt this kind of situation, knowing what the consequences are. So Hamas is not going to do anything as crazy as this because it knows what the consequences are. Wrong. Hamas has decided to do something crazy and accept those consequences. So it's a failure of intelligence, but it's also a failure of assumptions. And if you base your policy on the wrong assumptions, you're heading towards a disaster. The third thing is that it's a trauma for the Israelis, not just because, you know, the 240 hostages taken, which have dominated the news, but also because of, and I must be frank with you here, I'm going to be critical of the Israelis, but I have to be frank, of the brutal tactics used by Hamas. You know, children seeing their parents executed in front of them, people being burned alive, decapitated. I mean, you know, the Israelis know that Hamas doesn't like them, but this kind of sort of brutality has really shocked them, and if you say to an Israeli today, what about the two-state solution? They'll say, hey, October the 7th proves that these people hate us, you know, really do want our total destruction. Hamas has repeated that it will do the same thing again and again and again, and therefore, how can we possibly make peace with these guys, given, you know, the level of brutality that they have demonstrated? So it's a trauma for Israel. We can maybe talk in the questions about what the consequences long term are likely to be for Israel as a state, as a society, its policies. But in the short term, as far as the Israeli is concerned, the two-state solution is more off the table than ever. Now, let's look at the international diplomacy, part two of what I've had to say today. Well, first of all, we're seeing some very interesting things come out of this crisis thus far. Number one, the return of the United States. It's an incredible irony at a moment when we risk seeing Donald Trump being re-elected next year with his, you know, MAGA, Make America Great Again doctrine and American isolationism, turning America's back on Ukraine or on global issues. It's a terrible irony that the moment where America, psychologically speaking, is so keen to turn inward, that we're having this unbelievable demonstration of what Madeleine Albright, somebody I knew very well, remember the former US Secretary of State, called America the indispensable nation. But love America or hate America, you know, we've seen once again that nothing works unless the Americans get engaged. You know, the exchange of prisoners or hostages for Palestinian prisoners, the entry of the humanitarian aid through the Rafah crossing point in southern Gaza, the ceasefire, it's all being done by Qatar and America, plus a bit of Egypt, working together. But it's the United States that's been doing it, not, unfortunately, I'll say this in a moment, Dirk, you may disagree with me, but not the European Union. Now, why is Biden doing this? Well, first of all, I would argue that, and Ukraine's the same, Biden's a very good crisis manager, rather than somebody who has developed a long-term vision for American foreign policy and its role in the world. But look at Ukraine, he's been a good short-term crisis manager. Of course, the Americans are the only people that the Israelis are willing to listen to as well. And the United States, as I've said, has built good relations with the Gulf countries and with Egypt in recent years, essentially on the back of arms supplies. But there's another reason. American society has changed. 62% of Americans, according to a poll last week, favour a permanent ceasefire. The demonstrations in the United States have been mainly pro-Palestinian rather than pro-Israeli. Biden himself received the support of the 3.6 million Arab Americans when he was elected president 4 years ago. These people live essentially in places like Wisconsin, Chicago, Illinois, up there. Critical states, battleground states, where a little swing can put Trump back, and Trump's 6 points ahead in the opinion polls at the moment. So, and many of these Arab Americans have said to Biden bluntly and to his Democratic Party, look, you know, if you're not even-handed in dealing with this crisis, if you don't negotiate a ceasefire, then, you know, we're not going to vote for you next time round. And you may say, well, in a country of 320 million, what does 3.6 million make? But in a swing state, they're important, and they're better organised than they used to be and more vocal. So the United States doesn't sort of swing to the Israeli clock There's, of course, in Congress, weapons for Israel, support. It's, yes, among Republicans and evangelicals, it's still very strong. But the country has changed. And of course, Biden also has, as you saw yesterday, the issue that some of the hostages are American citizens. And if there's one thing that puts a US president under pressure, crisis after crisis, it's when an American citizen, albeit a 4-year-old girl with an Israeli citizenship as well, is detained. So Biden is under pressure also to show that he can get the American citizens back as well. And so far, you've got to argue that U.S. diplomacy has been relatively successful so far. The hostages are being released, another 15 hopefully today. The Americans are now pushing for more hostages to be released. The Israelis have agreed that they'll have one extra day ceasefire for 10 hostages extra being released. And there are still about 180 of these people being detained. So far, ceasefire, delivery of humanitarian aid, and the release of hostages. The difficult part, of course, is going to be now, because tonight at midnight, Israel normally should start bombing Gaza again. So we'll have to wait and see in the next few hours if the US is successful persuading the Israelis and Hamas to agree to an extension. For how many days? Another 4 days, longer? How many hostages? The hardest part is going to be that from now on, Hamas is going to demand more Palestinians to be released in proportion to Israelis. For example, a couple of years ago, the Israelis had to free 1,000 Palestinian fighters for one Israeli soldier who was detained in Gaza for 5 years before the trade went ahead. And the Israelis so far have had the relatively easy task of releasing just 3 Palestinians for 1 Israeli hostage, and women and children, not fighters. But if Hamas now says, no, we want the tough guys now, the fighters, the guys who have got, if you like, blood on their hands, at least as far as Israel is concerned, that is going to be a tough one, because Hamas will hold the Israeli soldiers, men and women, and demand a much, much higher price for them. The second thing that's going to be very interesting for you to study is basically how is Israel going to welcome the release of the hostages? Will it, on the one hand, encourage the Israelis to attack Hamas more? They don't have our hostages any longer, so we're free to do what we like. Or, on the other hand, the problem is that once the hostages are free for the Israelis, what they're trying to do, which is put the focus all the time on October the 7th. So yes, the Palestinians we know, but don't forget October the 7th. Who started it? Our suffering, our 1,200 dead. Once the hostage, at the moment, the plight of the hostages telling their stories, if you look at the news, is keeping, from an Israeli point of view, the focus very usefully on October the 7th. The other side of the story, the other side of the coin. Once the hostages are released, that ability of Israel to swing the narrative, and I'll say a few words about this at the end, back to their suffering rather than the Israeli reaction, is going to go down. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. And of course, the more, of course, for the Israelis that the Hamas is able to sort of micromanage the ceasefire and the release of the hostages, 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, the longer the ceasefire goes on, the harder it's going to be for Israel to restart the war, which is why many people on the right in Netanyahu's cabinet at the moment are saying, we've got to finish this now, because if we don't finish it now, in 2 weeks' time, the Americans are going to stop us. We won't be able to do it any longer, and we will be far from our objective of eliminating Hamas. So that is the problem going ahead. But so far, let's give the Americans credit for, I think, at least what they've been able to do. They've prevented the war escalating. Biden sent a message to the Iranian leader, Khamenei, saying, stay out. And so far, the Iranians, although obviously from a rhetorical point of view condemning Israel, you would expect no less than that, have largely stayed out. We've not seen, for example, a big movement by Hezbollah in Lebanon, or the Iranian proxies in southern Syria, for instance. There have been some attacks on American bases in Iraq and northern Syria, which the American Air Force have responded to, but we haven't had a sort of mass extension of the conflict. Apart from the West Bank, where 200 Palestinians have been killed since October the 7th, we have mainly the Americans managed, for the time being, to contain this conflict. That, at least, is something which is positive. But going ahead, the questions are very, very daunting. I mean, number one, what is Israel's military objective? Mussolini once declared that his aim was a war against flies. Any of you been to Italy? Seen a fly? I have. So a war against flies, a noble but impossible endeavor, right? So, the elimination of Hamas. The problem is if you look at the people who invaded Israel on October the 7th, there are a mixture of three groups. There's Hamas, there's Islamic Jihad, not controlled by Hamas, and there are gangs, criminals, just ordinary guys who thought, hey, the border's open, let's go and cause trouble, let's plunder. Who are Hamas in all of that? It's not an army. The people aren't in uniform. Where does it start? Where does it end? Is it all of Gaza? Is it what? How can we say we've eliminated Hamas? What does it mean? We take down their weapons, their rockets, their military structure, reduce their capacity to attack us. What do? In 1982, Israel went into Lebanon when the Palestinian Liberation Organization was still functioning, and they got Yasser Arafat and the PLO to get on a boat in Lebanon and go to Tunisia at the time and set up there. We're going to do the same, have Hamas. Most of the commanders are in Qatar, in any case, in Doha. So, the first task for the United States is to get Israel to focus on a more realistic objective than eliminating Hamas. The only thing, of course, from an Israeli point of view, is that anything that allows Hamas to reconstitute and to strike back is unacceptable. So where are we between the feasible and the desirable? Because, dear students, in life, what is desirable is not always feasible. And what is feasible is not always desirable. And you have to sort of find a medium point. Next thing, Gaza. What are we going to do about the future of Gaza? Who's going to run it? I mean, at the moment, the Israelis are occupying the north. But they withdrew in 2005 because they were just fed up with being an occupation force and being spat at by Palestinians. Palestinians are not going to accept an Israeli occupation. The Israelis don't want it. But they're going to hand over to the Palestinian Authority. No, an Arab peacekeeping force, a UN peacekeeping force, an EU peacekeeping force, under what kind of status and the like. That is all very, very hazy as well. And a lot of people are talking about a two-state solution. How do we go from a situation where this crisis has made everybody realize that the two-state solution is the only way forward, but the crisis takes us back from it every single day? So how do we bridge that sort of gap in terms of going from a crisis to some kind of long-term diplomatic strategy? Nobody's got good answers for this at the moment. A couple of remarks finally before I close about the EU, Russia, China, new multilateralism, and then I just want to give you my thinking on some of the long-term things that you guys, studying international relations, should be thinking about. The European Union so far has not had a good crisis, which for those of us like Dirk and I, who are Bruxellois in terms of our sort of diplomatic culture, is a great disappointment, particularly after the fantastic EU performance on Ukraine, arming the Ukrainians, helping with the budget, receiving 7 million Ukrainian refugees, showing a great deal of 12 packages of sanctions against Russia, or 11 and a half, nearly 12. Yeah, there were sort of hopes that the EU had finally sort of discovered what Jacques Puss, former foreign minister of Luxembourg, called the hour of Europe. Do you remember that? During the Balkans, the hour of Europe. We're going to be a big player, geopolitical player. But it's been a shambles. Ursula von der Leyen goes off and gives unqualified support to Israel. She's shot at by the rest of the EU for not being balanced. The Israelis now are about to expel the Belgian and the Spanish ambassadors because De Croo and Sanchez were in the region at the weekend and criticised Israel, and the Israelis don't like that. And here we go again. Macron voted against the EU position, France in the UN General Assembly on the ceasefire. So the EU has shown that the further away you go from Europe, the harder it is for the EU to come up with a common foreign and security policy. If you're dealing, with the immediate neighborhood, the Balkan, Ukraine, Moldova, it works, but not further forward. So can the EU still recover and still be a player? It's giving a lot of statements, but what actual leverage is it going to have? The problem for the EU is that whatever the peace settlement is, for example, the reconstruction of Gaza, which is going to cost billions upon billions of dollars, think of Ukraine and then think of Gaza, the EU will be invited to pay, which is what it's always done. It funds about 70% of the budget of the UN Relief and Works Administration. But paying does not give you influence. And that is the problem for the EU. Others who pay far less, like Russia and China, almost nothing. The Chinese, 100 million, not billion, million in humanitarian aid, end up having far more influence than the EU, which invests billions. So what are the consequences there? Russia, of course, like China, is in a difficult position, having good relations both with the Palestinians and the Arabs and with the Israelis, and have therefore tried, not to upset anybody too much. But Russia, of course, has tried to sort of show that this is all the fault of the Americans by spending too much time on Ukraine and not letting Russia win, rather than keeping an eye on the Middle East. It's very interesting with China, though. This may be a big opportunity for us, i.e. the West, to engage China. The Chinese are playing a big diplomatic role. Today, as I speak, nearly, they're chairing Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, a meeting in the UN Security Council, chairing on the Middle East situation. The Chinese have voted for UN resolutions on the Middle East. They haven't vetoed. They've really, they received an Arab contact group in Beijing last week. President Xi spoke to the BRICS last week, the BRICS movement. Again, very moderate speech. So the Chinese, are playing a role, but not in a way which is incompatible that Russia would be with Western diplomacy. And on the back of efforts by the EU and the US to improve relations with China, one good thing that might come out of this dreadful crisis, the Americans are back, the EU's got a problem, but there is an opportunity with the Chinese. It is precisely that. The UN. Good news for the UN. The UN is back. I've been writing articles over the last couple of years on, the sort of collapse of the UN. The Security Council can't agree on anything any longer. They took over a year before they had a meeting on COVID. My God. Confrontational world, the UN's useless. No. The Security Council has passed for the first time united resolutions, held meetings. We've seen in this crisis just how crucial the UN aid organisations are. UNICEF, because its children, 40% of the casualties are children in Gaza. The UNRWA, the Relief and Works Administration, they've had over 250 of their people killed. This is the costliest, in terms of UN deaths, operation since the founding of the United Nations. But we've seen in terms of the Refugee Agency that we really need the humanitarian services that the UN uniquely provides to kick in. And only the UN at the end of the day, with a bit of help from the Red Cross, is able to mobilise 200 trucks into Gaza and provide this kind of aid. So don't give up on the UN, which is, Guterres, the Israelis don't like him, but nobody in Israel likes the UN, at least not on the right. So he's got nothing to lose in that respect. But the United Nations is regaining some of its political humanitarian credibility here. And so that's a plus as well. And then let me just mention one thing and then I'll conclude. Finally, you're seeing on the back of this crisis the new multipolar world that you guys are going to live in and you're going to have to deal with. I mentioned that the US is still crucial, but only to the extent that the US is able to partner with other countries. For example, the US-Qatar relationship, the US-Saudi relationship have been absolutely vital. The Arabs are more active than ever before. In the past, the Arabs would have made a lot of noise and done nothing. No, not this time. Saudi Arabia has hosted the Arab League, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, ASEAN, the African Union. The Arabs, from a diplomatic point of view, are really gearing up to assert pressure, put their ideas on the table. They've got a voice here. We've had the BRICS that has had a session, although South Africa wants to take Israel to the International Criminal Court for genocide. which has obviously not made that an organisation that Israel would be prepared to listen to. But you're really seeing, we use this term, the global south. We are really seeing a mobilisation now of all of these other groupings of fora playing a role. It isn't just, NATO, the EU, the US, and nobody else matters. The rest are sort of third division players. No, we're not. We are now really seeing, a lot of different groups get involved. And so if you're the United States, you have to deal with all of these guys. You have to have relationships with them in order to do diplomacy. If you're not connected, you're dead. And the more people who are willing to work with you, and not just for you, the more effective you're going to be. So I'm not saying that this multilateral world was born in this Middle East crisis, but it's a powerful sign of what it all means. Now, long-term consequences, I'm going to mention them. What you coming out of this crisis, if you're somebody who does geopolitics, you're thinking, how do we deal with the Middle East? How do we stop the war? Of course, no doubt we've got. But you're thinking about, basically what are the shockwaves? What are the ripples that are going to come out of this that I'll have to deal with? Number one, radicalization. The longer this war goes on, the more there is a danger, both in the Middle East and in the West, that more people are going to sign up for ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and radical groups and movements. Young people are radicalized by these kind of things. Blood on the TV screens, perceptions of injustice, perceptions of Western complicity. In my where I am in London, we've had 300, I'm not joking, 300,000 pro-Palestinian demonstrators on the streets virtually every weekend, making a hell of a lot of noise with violence, although caused more by right-wing activists who try to disrupt these demonstrations. We've had political crises in the UK. We've had people resigning from the Labour Party shadow government over this. We've had a Home Secretary who's lost her job over this. So radicalisation is a worry. Just at the time when we've had the war on terror for 20 years with Afghanistan and Iraq and all the consequences, do we want to live through that again? That this becomes a kind of generational radicalisation moment. So that's one worry. Secondly, for somebody like me, Ukraine, because clearly, the air defence systems going to Israel aren't going to Kiev. The money that the US Congress is voting on is for Israel, not for Ukraine. Ukraine is off the TV screens, in Belgium at least, as much as I can see. Not entirely, but Zelensky doesn't have the automatic platform that he had in the first year of the war to rally support. Ukraine fatigue is in the air, of course. And Zelensky is also in a difficult situation. He's Jewish. He's given a lot of support to Israel, which means he risks losing support in the global south as a result. I read a story the other day that the Americans had taken out a lot of their intelligence aircraft from the Black Sea that was feeding intelligence to the Ukrainians to put them over Gaza to feed intelligence to the Israelis. So that's a consequence as well that we're going to have to think about. Another one is laws of war. And I know this is going to interest you here in Leuven. The laws of war. We've got into very complicated debates about what is permissible. How far does the right of self-defense go, particularly if you kill civilians? Is Al-Shifa Hospital a legitimate military target if the Israelis can prove that there's an Hamas command bunker? How big does the command bunker have to be? How many guns does Hamas have to have in a tunnel to make Al-Shifa, a hospital, a legitimate military target? Can you drop 2,000-pound bombs on an apartment building in a civilian area? It's tragic, but more women and children have been killed in this conflict in 2 months than in 2 years in Ukraine. And that is a telling statistic, of course. 10 to 13,000, we don't quite know how many, but with millions of displaced. So, the right of self-defense, which the Israelis claim, yes, we all agree about the right of self-defense, but how far can you go legally or before you lose your legitimacy? That's something else that we all need to think about. Also, the war of the narratives. Who's winning the propaganda war? The war of the narrative. The Israelis are sort of doing a very conventional campaign with government spokesmen like me when I was NATO spokesman giving press conferences. Hamas is not doing much speaking, practically none, but it's just allowing the pictures from Gaza to be their own propaganda machine, their own information campaign. Just show, that's all we need, just show the pictures. We don't actually need to speak or give our positions. So, one is try to get the media on your side. The other is simply let the media film. The Israelis have not allowed any Western journalists to go into Gaza. So it's very difficult to really establish what the facts really are in what Clausewitz called the fog of war. So there are very interesting lessons here for the way in which you try to spin your narrative in this conflict as well. And then finally, deterrence. I'm at NATO, as Dirk knows, and I promise you this is my last point for my talk before we get into questions. I spent 38 years thinking about deterrence. How do you stop somebody attacking you? What military posture do you need? Which signals do you send? You hit me, I'm going to hit you 3 times as hard. You break my nose, I'm going to cut your head off. Deterrence. The Israelis have always been massive believers in deterrence. And my old organisation, NATO, since Putin annexed Crimea in 2014, has gone back to doing deterrence. We won't have war with Russia. We will deter them. We'll know what they're doing. We'll know what their intentions are. They'll know what our response is going to be. They won't do anything stupid, right? Because they understand that they will lose rather than gain. Israel has always based its existence on deterrence, and since 1973, which is the last major sort of clash with the Egyptians in the Yom Kippur War, deterrence has worked for the Israelis pretty well until October the 7th. So if I was at NATO, I would really sort of, Secretary General Dirk, I'd be sort of calling my military advisors into the office and saying, hey guys, this deterrence thing, are we really sure that, what we've got is working? Do we really know what the other side is up to? Is our intelligence really sort of up to it? Is our posture really the right one? And so on. And if we fail, and if we're going to get forced into a war, how can we be sure that we win it quickly and at an acceptable cost? So just a couple of thoughts about things that you may want to think about going forward. But I've said far too much, and now it's up to you to do the talking. And I'll try to come up with some answers. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, dear students. I think we had here something special this afternoon, and I'll let you think about your own questions. But let me thank, on behalf of all of us, Jamie Shee for a number of things. I mean, his forceful insights into the main developments in the Middle East, and also pointing from a psychological point of view, I would say, to the attitudes of the main players, in this case, Israel, Hamas. You also touched upon the situation in the United States, in the EU, United States. The figure, which I found rather impressive, and I guess also the students, 3.8 million Arab American voters in swing states.
Yeah, key places.
Yeah, is quite something. It's an insight, of course, the absence of the European Union, and we can maybe also discuss that a bit. Then the very delicate questions and human questions on the future, the immediate future of the ceasefire that ends normally tonight. I mean, I was this morning in a discussion on the ceasefire between the two Koreas, which was not peace, but it was at least a ceasefire, and it lasts already 70 years, 7-0. Is quite something. So ceasefires can last longer than their initial intention. Thank you also for touching upon, let's say, the more geostrategic aspect: China, Russia, United Nations, of course, and the complexity for diplomacy. Also, I mean, what's desirable is not always feasible, and vice versa. But also that in today's world, multipolar world, your world, our world, your world for the future. In diplomacy, you have to be even more connected, much more connected, in order to remain or become a player. And I think that that the example of the Qatar diplomacy is an interesting example, of course, backed up by all the experience of the American diplomacy. And then you ended with the long-term, some long-term perspective, or at least the questions for the longer term. So, a lot of a great menu to think about. So, who would like to go first to the question? Please state maybe your name, your nationality, because we have an international audience here of students. And then you can also make comments if you want. But if you ask a question, you have a much better chance to get an answer, I think. So who goes first? I will regroup the questions. I saw there, yes, of course, and there. So the first three, and then we go in the second round. Okay, you start.
Thank you for the talk. My name is Leila and I'm from France. So you touched upon the United Nations and I was wondering, so recently they used the resolution 377 Uniting for Peace to have the General Assembly voting a non-binding resolution after the US deadlocked 4 times on the Israel-Palestinian conflict. And I was wondering, in regard of the numbers you gave of Arab American voters, wouldn't it be a sort of isn't the US shooting in its own foot with the voters coming against them, and even most of the Americans being pro-Palestinians more and more, whereas the government is pro-Israel, and the United Nations passing this non-binding resolution in the General Assembly to call for peace, while the US delegate, I think the thing she said the most was the omission of evils in her talk during this session in the General Assembly. So yeah, I wanted to have your opinion on, isn't it a way for the US to literally shoot in their own feet with this whole situation regarding the American Arab voters and the United Nations position in the General Assembly?
Mm-hmm. There was also the three-way, you call it three-way split vote among the Europeans, which is always a bad sign. So please.
Hello, my name is Joel. Actually, you were previously a professor of mine at the Vesalius College. You were in global history since 1945. So you mentioned that there were difficulties in terms of negotiation for example, one part for the one country stance or two states. Do you think that for the current conflicts that it will be solved either through a military victory, or do you think that there are some short-term opportunities or short-term solutions through negotiations? That's it. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, that was, we'll come to you right away. So.
First of all, thank you for your very interesting college. I'm from Belgium, and recently I had a conversation with someone who's a little bit pro-Palestine, and he suggested, and I don't know if it's true, that's why I want your opinion on it, that Netanyahu knew what was coming on October 7th because his support was dropping, and there's nothing that unifies a country like a war, so he thought that maybe he saw it coming and let it in so he could have more of a national union behind him. And I was wondering what your opinion is on that.
Shall we take these three?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay?
First of all, as I was expecting, really very, very good questions. Put me under pressure to try to give good answers. Going, if I can, in a reverse order. The answer is I don't know if there was some sort of conspiracy going on that Netanyahu actually sort of wanted this to happen in order to sort of rescue his government from a beleaguered position with the demonstrations and the Constitutional Court and so on. I personally find it difficult to believe that would be the case, because clearly he's going to get a lot of the blame. When the dust settles, there's going to be a 90. You remember in the US after 9/11, there was a 9/11 commission that went painstakingly through all of the evidence, and most of the people I talk to think that Netanyahu isn't likely to survive this. Once the story comes out, you could argue it in the opposite way that by taking on the Supreme Court and therefore alienating the army and the intelligence services, he sort of diverted them from doing their job, which was to sort of keep watch on Israel's enemies. So I can't personally, think that in any way, he had any reason to benefit. You could argue the opposite. He from his point of view, he was, with the right-wing coalition, was sort of moving ahead with the reform of the Supreme Court. Still very contentious, but it was going through the Knesset. He's got a majority, he was getting the votes, and he was not in any immediate danger of being driven out of power. And what he was obviously worried about was losing his immunity from prosecution because of all of the corruption charges against him and his wife in Israel. That wasn't likely to happen. So I don't know, but just looking at the objective factors, key boda, who profits, I can't see that he would have had any interest in that. I mean, I think, if you looked at his face after it all happened, he looked just as shocked as everybody else. So that would be my answer there. Military victory, probably no, because, very good question. Good to see you again, by the way. I'm glad to see that you've graduated up here since Vesalius in Brussels. When you look at big international events, the question you always have to ask is this a transformative event? I mean, I would argue that 9/11 was a transformative event, because the US went off and did silly things, in Afghanistan and Iraq for many years, and we had the war against terror and everything that happened. The US lost a lot of its moral authority for the way in which it used torture, you remember, and so 9/11 clearly was an event, for good or bad, that changed the world. I would argue that Putin's invasion of Ukraine, or at least in Crimea, changed the world. NATO went back to collective defense, Russia became more isolated, Russia and China came closer together. So if you look at events, you'd argue, is this business as usual? When the dust settles, we're actually going to realize not much has really changed. We're back where we were. At Oxford, I had a great history professor called A.J.P. Taylor, and he wrote a fantastic book on the revolutions of 1848. And he said, history reached a turning point and didn't turn. Mm-hmm. It's a great phrase. History reached a turning point, but then didn't turn. Things went back as they were. And so from a US point of view, if you look at what's happening, they probably think that we're going to go back to the status quo ante. Israel will still have Hamas in Gaza, won't be able to eliminate it. Gaza will still be occupied by Palestinians. They won't go to Jordan. They won't all go to Egypt, because those two countries refuse to let them in. They have enough. Jordan has enough Palestinians already. Hezbollah will still be there on the border with Lebanon. Iran will still be a big issue. The Iranian nuclear program will still be going on. Assad will still be in power in Damascus. Israel will still have the issues on the West Bank. So in a way, it will still be the same problems. Probably worse, but the same problems we had before. So from that point of view, there's no sense of a military victory if you can't change things in a positive way. The problem if you talk about an Israeli military victory against Hamas, who are Hamas? They all look like you, forgive me, but they're all in civilian clothes. Some are probably regular fighters, others are part-time, some are in organised crime, some just join in. Everybody's got a gun in Gaza. Who is Hamas? Nobody and everybody, a very sort of decentralised leadership. It's a social movement. It does a lot of social works as well, charitable works and the like, public administration. Even if you eliminate the fighters, the charitable side and the public administration side will still be there. And it has, like an octopus, the capacity to regenerate quickly. You can't kill an idea, right? So you can deplete it, you can sort of prevent it from attacking you in 10 years because they take time to recover their weapons, their money, and the like. But what's a military victory that simply mows the lawn is no good. In Afghanistan, we did mowing the lawn. In other words, we attacked Al Qaeda, and at the end of the week, like the grass that you mow, it all grew back again. We were no further forward. So, to my sense, probably no. The Israelis may declare that that's their aim because they're under the shock of October the 7th. And they feel now that they have to protect themselves. But going back to the total security solution isn't going to work at all. To really deal with Hamas, you have to deal with Hezbollah, you have to deal with Iran. That is a completely different order of things. But the two-state solution, of course, is the only alternative. But how do we get there? And I think that the hardest thing, as I said, for diplomats is how do you get from sort of crisis management day to day to thinking about how do I turn this crisis into something productive in terms of some kind of negotiation. Now, probably not immediately because you can't do it with Netanyahu and the right wing. So you have to hope that this crisis is basically going to discredit Netanyahu, discredit the religious parties, discredit the settlers. The biggest thing that we can do at the moment is to get the Israelis to rein in the settlers, particularly by disarming them. Because if one thing is going to sort of keep this war going, it's going to be there will be an uprising now in the West Bank, another intifada, where you've got far more Palestinians living, and that's going to be potentially worse. So you'll get a more sort of Labour Party, sort of middle of the road coalition of former generals, because peace was always made in Israel by former generals. Ehud Barak, Rabin, always, not civilians, always former generals. Knowing war, they know a lot more about peace than the civilians do. So somebody like Benny Gantz, for example, who's back in this sort of war cabinet at the moment. So you get a more middle-of-the-road government. They have their sort of 9/11 type commission, to discover what went wrong. The dust will settle. And eventually, some negotiation will start. But the problem, though, is that they can't talk to each other. It's impossible. They won't be in the same room together. So you're going to have to sort of figure out some kind of framework that you can establish that is going to get negotiations going. For example, the Iranians and the Americans don't talk to each other. They're in different rooms in a hotel, and the EU goes between them. Sharing texts and positions, proximity until eventually have common ground. You're going to need something like an Oslo process again, like you had, remember in the 90s where the Norwegians invited Israeli Palestinian diplomats for cozy weekends in hotels in Norway and, in the sauna, got them to talk to each other. We call it track 2 diplomacy. You're familiar with that term, track 2? Build confidence, you're not as bad as I thought you were, sharing pictures of children, dogs. No, not jokes, and gradually think, we can, that's how Oslo happened. We can gradually learn to work together, leaving it to a third party like the Norwegians who are very good at that kind of thing. So there are ways forward, but as I've said, they are long-term, and Israel has to go through the trauma and be in the healing process before I think we can contemplate that. But there's no alternative. The other thing, of course, is that the Israelis have got to sort of accept that the two-state solution is Gaza and West Bank. The idea that you can push it into Lebanon or you can push it into Jordan or somewhere else, give the problem to one of the Arab neighbours isn't going to work. And then the US, a really good question there. The US has a legal obligation to arm Israel. It goes back to the Obama administration, where Obama had to accept, under pressure from the Republicans, a congressional law which says that in a crisis, the US has an obligation to give Israel what it needs for its defense. It's a legal obligation. And today, Chuck Schumer, who is the Democrat senator of in the United States, is pushing, a bill of $14 billion for an initial package of aid to Israel. And in Republican circles, particularly evangelicals, as I've said, that support for Israel is strong. In fact, funnily enough, there's more support for Israel among non-Jewish American evangelicals, particularly in the South, because of biblical interpretations of the scripture, than there is among American Jews who are supportive generally of Israel, but, there's, for example, a lobbying group called J Street in Washington, which is a Jewish lobby, but very pro-Palestinian, much more in the peace camp and the like. And so you're going to have, I think, on this in American politics, a classical division between Republicans, largely supportive, and Democrats who are largely swinging towards Palestine. I think Biden is doing what every president tries to do, which is to keep everybody happy by sort of straddling the divide between the two camps. A bit for Israel. If you look at his rhetoric, it's very careful. Israel right to self-defense, but ceasefire and so on. But as I've said, whether the United States has got a long-term policy for moving this forward, we'll see. And Trump will be very, very supportive of Israel, of course. And you remember in the past that when Netanyahu went to Washington, he never went to the White House. During the Obama administration, Obama being a Democrat, you remember, Dirk, when Netanyahu went to Washington, he bypassed the White House because he thought Obama was some kind of pinky, who was not supportive. And he went directly, to see the Republican hardliners in the Congress. And he brought out all of the maps of Iran and nuclear weapons and so on. That was always, Netanyahu's policy, beef up the Iranian nuclear threat, get the Americans scared, portray Israel as America's only sort of supporter in that sort of region. And of course, if Netanyahu stays in power, I think it's going to be difficult. But if he stays in power and Trump gets elected, I think he will sort of replay that sort of strategy based on fear of Iran, Iranian influence, to try to get, unconditional US Republican support for Israel again. So he'll be playing a little bit of waiting game and just praying that, Biden doesn't win the election next November.
Thank you. So next round, you start, and then Ian.
Thank you. So I never had the opportunity to ask this question to an official. So when I saw Bashar al-Assad in this Arab leader meeting, I was quite outraged that, as you said, now is considered as frequentable again. And my question is, how, in Libya, it was that easy in almost 2 weeks to act and to make a difference, while Syria is still as in war as it is now, and how there is no action, why no one acted. Obama, I did a research one on it, I understood, but why there is not international action?
Yeah. Thank you. So we have here on this side.
Thank you very much. Professor, thank you for your presentation. I'm going to exploit your national origin here to get your view on the perspective from Whitehall. One thing that I've found really interesting talking to friends who are close to the former Foreign Secretary, predecessor to Lord Cameron, James Cleverly, was the view of, and going back to your point on Iran and America's hard line potentially coming back in November, what role do you think Whitehall can play in terms of being interlocutor between the hardened American view towards the Middle East and perhaps a more moderated approach to balancing a policy in the Middle East in the absence of Europe having a unified front on this topic?
You mean, if I may, Jim, you meant overall Middle East or specifically the Iranian nuclear?
Both, frankly. I mean, I think there might be a role in both situations. Who was next?
Yeah, we go. And then we come here.
So thank you for your answer, and then the possibility that Trump is reelected and creates this, gets hand in hand, let's say, with Israel. There was just say, it's commonly known that the U.S. Post-Cold War has taken leadership of the Middle East and Arab countries. The thing is, now China, with the support of Palestine and with their relation with Arab countries, it is said that they might be the new leaders of the Middle East. So I was wondering, in a geostrategic context, how would that work with Israel, and if Trump is reelected, how would that work with Israel and US on one side and China getting the other Arab countries, and in terms of China-US rivalry? I don't know if that's clear, but the question would be, what would happen in this situation with China taking the leadership of the Middle East and Trump being reelected?
Okay. Thanks, Dirk, you're lucky. You really got great students here. obviously great professor, but no, sincerely, they're fantastic questions, really. In fact, I don't think I would have been sufficiently intelligent to think of such good questions myself, and I say that quite honestly. With Assad, well, yes, I mean, it's pretty depressing, right? If anybody should be in front of the International Criminal Court in Hague, it should be him. I think there are two sort of basic trends. I mean, first of all, the United States was mainly interested in Syria because of ISIL, and still has troops in Syria, about 1,500. No, maybe less, about 800, sorry, up in the north, which have been recently attacked by Iranian proxy forces, and the Americans have launched airstrikes. But they're not there to deal with Assad. They're there to deal with the remnants of ISIL and to work, with those Kurdish forces, the Syrian Democratic Army, as it's called, that haven't yet been sort of obliterated by Turkey, and which are still sort of guarding, in places like Al-Hol, the ISIL fighters from the Caliphate after 2017, the women, the children, and trying, to sort of keep an eye on any attempt by ISIL to reconstitute itself in northern Iraq or Syria. So first of all, I think, the tragedy is explained by the fact that for the United States, it was only ISIL and not Assad, particularly once Obama, as was rightly said, stepped back from the brink in terms of launching airstrikes in response for Assad's use of chemical weapons, proven now by a UN investigative team. In fact, France was particularly outraged at the time by this. The French had their jets on the tarmac ready to fly, just waiting for the Americans to launch, and then Obama didn't do it. And history has been quite tough on Obama in terms of, decisive moments, important turning points, deterrence and all of that stuff, which I was saying at the end of my talk, missing that opportunity to really display deterrence and credibility. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing, and maybe this is a good thing, but one of the things that the Gulf Arab states have done is to realise that, trying to throw their muscle around by using military force wasn't working for them. You remember the Saudis got involved in Yemen and the UAE as well for a period of time. Remember the Saudis were using their air force to bomb Houthis but hitting the wrong target, leading to a humanitarian disaster. The Qataris were also, intervening in Libya. Together with some of the others on various sides. There was this sort of policy of direct sort of interference through proxies and funding of mercenaries and the like. In a way, what's good is that they basically decided that wasn't really bringing them any benefits. They weren't getting anywhere. The Iranians were just giving more weapons to the Houthis. And the Houthis have now been firing those weapons against Israel, ironically, intercepted by the American Navy. And so you see the Arab countries now deciding to go the diplomatic route. We're going to recognise, at least re-establish relations with Assad, invite him to attend meetings of the Arab League once more, send our diplomats back to the embassy in Damascus and so on. And you see this diplomacy being played big time. The Saudis, despite Prince Salman's terrible reputation after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, have been trying with the Americans to broker peace in Sudan. With the Americans, wow, Prince Salman, the peacemaker, they're trying very hard. The Saudis even negotiated the surrender of the Ukrainian forces in the Crimea at Mariupol. You remember when the Ukrainians surrendered to the Russians a year ago? You remember the siege of Mariupol? The Saudis negotiated that. So in a way, you could say, oh, well, it's great that these guys are no longer doing stupid things, arming groups in Libya, bombing the wrong target. The Saudi Air Force was worse than the rest of us at hitting the right target, and are now going the diplomatic track. But of course, unfortunately, if you do diplomacy, you do realpolitik. You make peace with your enemies, not your friends. Now, Winston Churchill once said, I would have supper with the devil if it would help me to defeat Adolf Hitler, and he meant it. He meant it. And this is the problem that you have. You have to deal with the actors and the players. We'll see. But of course, it leaves a bad taste in my mouth. There's no doubt about that. Whitehall, right? The UK recently has sort of got out of power politics a bit. We're out of the EU. We don't know what's going to happen in the United States with Trump coming back, which was obviously incompatible with many of the values that British society, maybe not the Conservative Party, shares. And therefore, we're going to be the moral power of the world. We're going to have conferences on artificial intelligence. I'm not joking. We're going to have conferences on Ukrainian reconstruction. If you're in London, I live in London, there's a conference there every week, that the Foreign Office is sponsoring on some noble theme, which I'm not mocking, the future of cities, the next pandemic, we've sort of got into this kind of, well, we're only small, but we're called Britannia. We have good universities, apart from Leuven. We have good science. Look at COVID. We invented the vaccine. So call Britannia. We're going to market ourselves as the meeting place. London. Everybody comes to have a good old conference on some worthy topic. And the Prime Minister gives a speech. So we're going to be the kind of normative regulatory power. And of course, suddenly you get a situation like the Middle East coming up, where the UK, once again, is sort of forced into looking at, well, what can we do in hard power terms? I mean, if you look at Ukraine, we've run out of weapons. Now our argument with Ukraine is, well, we gave them tanks first. We're the good guys, because we were the first ones to say, okay to tanks. We can't give them any tanks any longer because we've run out. So in other words, we'll be the first to set the example, but afterwards the Germans with the money will take over and provide the real things on a short budget. We've cut the foreign aid budget and so on. So you're right. I think it's a very legitimate question. You in a way you can always, by choosing a high-powered diplomat, a former Prime Minister, Lord Cameron, who goes around with his former reputation to sort of compensate for the fact that there's not much money or resources behind. But I think what you're going to find increasingly is that the UK will align itself with EU positions, as it's done on Ukraine, as it's done on Iran, as it's done on the Balkans, and many other things. And quietly, we've turned up at meetings of this European political community. If you're familiar with that, with Macron, for a broader dialogue, we like that kind of thing. We'll work with France very carefully, with Germany. We'll repair our relations with these key European partners. We won't do it through Brussels so much because David Cameron, he's the guy who did Brexit, right? Involuntarily. So it's very difficult for Cameron to work with Brussels, because everybody hates him in Brussels for good reason. He's the guy who messed up Brexit and caused all of this commotion in the EU. So we'll probably therefore avoid the Brussels machinery as long as we can, and go to Paris, go to Berlin, go to Warsaw, the guys that we could talk to, and try to build coalitions that way. So that's the way I see it going. But on Iran, we are part of this kind of these group of countries that directly negotiate, and we're still in the UN Security Council. So where we've got a foot in the door that gives us some kind of entree into the world of the great powers, we will keep it to the best way we can. China, really great question on China, really interesting. My line, of course, is that we should exploit the opportunities here of constructive Chinese diplomacy. I mean, the Chinese are a player in the Middle East. They're big investors in the UAE, investing in ports, Dubai Ports Authority, which is now a big player. They buy the Saudi oil. More Saudi oil goes to China these days than anywhere else. But they've also invested very heavily in Israel. Russia has 1 million Russians who live in Israel. So what's interesting at the BRICS meeting last week, where they had this video BRICS conference, is that the South Africans, Cyril Ramaphosa, was charging in, against Israel. We're going to expel the ambassador. We won't invite the ambassador back until we have a durable ceasefire. We demand that the International Criminal Court opens proceedings against the Israeli government. But the Chinese and the Russians, Putin and Xi spoke, were very, very moderate, saying all the right things, but careful, to keep their bridges open. The Chinese, for example, have sent a mediator to Ukraine. who went to Moscow, and everybody said to the Chinese, look, guys, if you want to mediate, you've got to go to Kiev as well. Do we really have to? Can we not just have a video conference with Zelensky? No, if you go to Moscow. And the Chinese then went to Kiev. And I think, they're trying to show that they can be mediators. They can be good citizens. They've recently done a deal with the Americans on tech. They've done a deal with the Americans on climate change ahead of the COP and so on. So, we had the summit between Xi and Biden in San Francisco just a week ago. You remember the APEC meeting. So I'm not trying to let the Chinese off the hook entirely, but I think that if you're a Western diplomat, you want to think, well, wait a minute, we shouldn't just reject this out of hand. Anything we can do to get the Chinese to be good players here and to help us towards a solution is welcome, and maybe they'll get an appetite for being mediators and therefore develop better relations with the West in return. You as a diplomat, you have to try to exploit opportunities no matter how slim, because the alternative is no opportunities, and that's far worse, right? Yeah.
Can I just make one comment on your?
Yeah.
No, if just add one thing, because I think it's interesting what you're saying about resources and so for a diplomatic system. If in this case of the Middle East conflict, you want to go back to the fundamentals, as we probably should, in order to engage in a real effort for peace after the arms have, then it can only be an all-encompassing, all-consuming effort for any national diplomatic system or system of an organization. I mean, it requires a lot of resources. I think manpower, of course, intellectuals with the right moral standards, and much more. And the Norwegians, I mean, there was not just one person. They mobilized quite.
Yeah.
They mobilized a system.
Yeah.
And so if today we screen the diplomatic systems in the world, I'm not sure I could immediately identify the one candidate who would like to offer, prepared to offer, this type of investment in an effort in the Middle East, because it's clear that it will be an all-consuming effort for that diplomatic system. So maybe, of course, the US, they could do it, UK maybe, they have the power, the EU, but the EU is absent. Turkey has a rather strong diplomatic system. Maybe Saudi Arabia. I mean, there are potential candidates, but maybe not at the moment, not yet real candidates. And I mean, for many countries, it will become a one-issue investment. I mean, if you want to deal in diplomacy with several problems at the same time, you often get into trouble. I don't know if you agree with that.
No, I do, Dirk. The thing about Norwegians is they've had a lot of UN envoys to the Middle East, so they've got skin in the game. You know that good British expression, skin in the game. There's the Norwegian Refugee Council, run by the brilliant Jan Egeland, who's a previous Undersecretary of the UN for Humanitarian Affairs. So, in which the government with money invests heavily. They've got the resources from the oil wealth, so they can bankroll these kind of efforts. So, Dirk, I agree with you entirely. So, it's more difficult for a country that doesn't have skin in the game. The other thing is with Turkey is that, yes, I mean, Israel and Turkey that have had very difficult relations over the Palestinians because Erdogan sees himself as the great champion of the Palestinian cause. And there was a demonstration of 1 million in Istanbul, I mean the biggest of all in Turkey. And Erdogan has been using terminology like genocide. He doesn't sort of go soft on the rhetoric, Erdogan, we well know. And unfortunately that quiet rapprochement between Israel and Turkey has probably now been set back by this. The Israeli ambassador and his family have left Ankara for safety reasons more than anything else. I also think, coming back to what I was saying earlier, that there's going to be a lot of bloodletting in Israel once this is over, in the intelligence services and in the army. Who's responsible? If you know the Israelis, love them or hate them, but they have this capacity to be very self-critical to an extent. and to my sense is that it's going to be very difficult to move on a peace process before they've reconstituted their diplomacy and their intelligence services. There's going to be a purge in a way, and we're going to have to wait for the new figures to emerge with a more moderate government. So I think that this will get the thing back on track, but it's going to take an awful lot longer than people think. And when you're dealing with peace, the question is how do you bridge the period between now and the possibility of starting some kind of peace process in a way that doesn't sort of make the delay endless? This is, I think, going to be the real sort of tough issue. I know I'm going to get to heaven, but how do I bridge the gap between now and the day, when that's going to happen? That's the real issue, which I think, is the reason why we have more questions than we have answers at the moment.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really interesting. And I'm from Michigan, so I can really confirm it's the state with the largest population of Arab Americans in the United States, also a swing state. And I can confirm that among members of my generation, not just Arab Americans, at least through social media, I obviously haven't been there, but there's this kind of, a lot of people my age are saying never Biden, will never support someone who they believe is funding genocide, supporting a state that's occupying another people. And that's great. That's their choice not to support Biden. But what I really notice is that in the US, there are very, very few politicians. It's very rare that you have the opportunity to vote for a politician that supports a ceasefire, let alone is critical of Israeli occupation and Israeli tactics. So I wanted to ask first what you make of the seeming disconnect between public opinion. I mean, clearly there are more people, a larger percentage of people in the United States support a ceasefire at least than the number of politicians in Congress who will say that they support a ceasefire or even criticize Israel at all. And second of all, do you think it's possible that generational changes will shift this dynamic of the U.S. being kind of wholeheartedly supporting Israel, funding their occupation, funding their war, and if not, do you think it's possible that could shift? If not, why? And if so, how do you think it could shift? That's a lot.
No, big questions.
Thank you again as well for the presentation. With your talks about the multipolar world, so what are your views on the risks of moving towards a more multipolar world? Because we've seen in history, but also these, I think of the early 20th century, but also just these past years, that cold conflicts gotten a lot more hot. Thinking about Ukraine, Nagorno-Karabakh, Israel. Most of these end or are moving towards a situation where, from an objective point of view, I think the aggressors tend to, in the end, probably gain more than they had in the beginning. So do you think we're also going to see more small-time regional conflicts flare up, especially also in connection to the point you made about deterrence? And what about the risks of possibly more local conflicts in the future?
Thank you for the speech. And I'm wondering, within the context of radicalization, do you think if the conflict even lingers further, there will be any major expansion of foreign terrorist fighters as it was in Syrian civil war that affects the region politics? Thank you.
Well, again, fantastic questions. I'll have to do my best here. Thanks for your comments on the Arab Americans. I defer to your greater knowledge because obviously you're American, so you know the context better than I. At least thanks for not contradicting what I said. It's always embarrassing when you're the professor and you get contradicted by the greater knowledge of your students. So no, what struck me about this crisis. And again, this is only an impression, it's not scientific. But watching TV, like all of us, I've been struck by how articulate the Arab Americans are on TV. I remember previous crises, you didn't see these people at all. You had the American Jewish Committee and, the traditional supporters of Israel from civil society, NGOs and so on speaking out. But what struck me this time is, we're getting these things like, I don't have the exact names, but, Arab American Council and, groups are coming up with very articulate spokespeople who are, not coming across as violent extremists, but making the case in a very articulate way to an international audience, to an American audience, in terms of what's going on and a ceasefire. So I certainly think the Arab American community seems to have got its act together in terms of its ability to do what you have to do in the United States, which is out-communicate everybody else. Get media attention, get out there, be visible, make your case, but have attractive spokespersons who, don't switch off the average American, but oh my God, that's a sort of a terrorist in disguise, but come across as they should, as very articulate, very reasonable. So I definitely think there's been a generational change in the slickness of the, because all politics at the end of the day is about slick organisations able, to get the message across and dominate the media space. It definitely have improved there. When it comes to Congress, you're right. Those people who have been, for example, Muslim congressmen and women have been a bit on the margins, often taking a lot of stick, frankly, not easy position for them in Congress. So to some degree, you could probably argue that the composition of Congress still doesn't reflect totally the demographics of the United States today. Presumably that will be corrected over time as old Congress people retire and new ones are elected, that the political system will reflect more the country rather than be self-perpetuating. So I think you're probably right there. I mean, many people in Congress, as you know, have sort of grown up with this dispute and very much in the past, listening to the Israelis. The Israelis, to give them credit, have got an enormous embassy in Washington, enormous embassy. The most important job in the Israeli diplomatic service is the ambassador to Washington, massive thing. And of course, they spend a hell of a lot of time and resources with Congress, lobbying. They've got, lots of NGOs that support Israel, getting the message across. They've got political action committees. If you're a congressman wanting to get elected, the first thing you would go off to do would be to speak at an Israeli Jewish rally. There are many, as you know, and if you didn't do it, it was like a French president not turning up at the farmers' show in Paris. Political suicide. If I want to get elected in France, the first thing I do is go and stroke cows at the farmers' market. And in America, without being facetious on this, but the first thing you did, is that this was the rite of passage to get elected, because these were the people who could kill you. Like the gun lobby, if you weren't on side or on these issues, given the weight that they carried. So I think that's why you probably got a generation of Congress people who've sort of grown up in this kind of environment, which is more and more out of step with the reality. The question to you is that when you get an election, will gradually, the Congress catch up with the demographics, as I've said? Will you find that, more Mexican Americans, Black Americans, Muslim Americans and so on, from minority communities like the Somalis in Wisconsin and so on, will they get elected to change this over time? The Democratic Party seems definitely to have shifted in this respect. There is a left wing of the Democratic Party, as you know, and they've been quite critical of Biden for sort of, trying to play piggy in the middle. But that's just my speculation. Risks of a multipolar world, that is a really good question. Well, it's a reality, right? Of course, many people will argue that it's justice, the global south, a greater voice, the wake-up call of Ukraine, where 36 countries in the UN General Assembly sat on the fence and didn't vote resolutions criticising Russia. The South Africas, the Brazils, the Lulas, wanting to say it's not our war, we've got other problems, and your support for Ukraine has made life more complicated for us in terms of disrupting trade, The aid you would have given to us has gone to Kiev. You've heard all of these arguments. Our energy prices have gone up, our inflation has gone up. If I listen to African leaders today, they always blame the war in Ukraine for their problems. Inflation, it's the war. You could say that it's a bit of a scapegoat, but it's an argument. These conflicts have global ramifications. Why is Macron suddenly in Angola? Why would Macron visit Angola, for heaven's sake? It's because, less Russian oil in Europe means you go in search for it elsewhere. You can see the ramifications on a global basis. And I think, Ukraine has been a bit of a wake-up call that the rest of the world doesn't necessarily march to the hymn sheet that the West defines. And one of the big things now is the competition between Russia and China on the one hand and the United States on the EU for who is going to get the hearts and minds of the global south, as it's called. You have the Chinese with One Belt, One Road, getting everybody in Beijing a couple of days ago. And then you have Global Gateway of the EU and resolutions of the US to fund the IMF and the World Bank. Our offer's better than your offer. Come to me like cars. I'll give you a better deal, than you're going to get from the guy next door. So there is more of a competition. And of course, in the what we call the global south, I don't like the term, but the less developed countries, they know that they're being courted. So there is a sense, well, he told me 3,000 euros. What are you going to give me? Give me a better price. So there is a certain degree, these countries are quite savvy of playing one off against the other. The other thing is that it allows countries to be swing states. You've got a large number of countries today that the Americans call frenemies. They're with you on a Monday, but don't count on them being there for you on Tuesday. Look at Turkey. It's in NATO, but it also, buys a lot of weapons from Russia, nuclear power from Russia. Erdogan and Putin are big buddies. Look at the Saudis, with the Americans, but with the Chinese. Lula is also, you've got a lot of these countries think, well, I don't have to get married. I can have lots of partners, it's perfectly okay. I have partner one on Monday and partner B on Tuesday. And it's a much messier world because of these sort of transactional sort of relationships there. Look at Hungary, for example, in the EU, or Poland recently. There's this sense that, we don't need to show alignment any longer. We can pursue our own interests. We can have transactional relations. We can raise the price. We can be bought off. By saying, well, you want me to vote for you? I want more investments or whatever. So it's certainly, from a moral point of view, a more complicated and less kind world as countries increasingly become transactional. But it can work to our advantage as well in the West because, for example, Putin's invasion of Ukraine has pushed Finland and Sweden into NATO, which wouldn't have happened otherwise. You could argue that the EU has now come up with this enormous leap forward of offering membership to 10 countries, including Ukraine, which was never on the agenda before the war in Ukraine, and that therefore, we are now sort of resuscitating the West a little bit. People write articles saying NATO has never been as strong today because it's gone back to collective defence. So I think, as always, it swings and roundabouts. You gain here and you lose there. And therefore, are you further forward at the end of the day? The real issue is that the world is being divided into camps. And the organisations like the UN or the Organisation for Security Cooperation in Europe, which try to represent the bridge builders between the different camps, have lost out. The regional groupings have done well. We circle the wagons, democracies together against the authoritarians. And as I said, that's why I think the UN has got this great chance in the Gaza crisis that it's been lacking. The bridge builders, as I say, suffer as well. The real test, of course, in the future is, number one, preventing this from becoming a new Cold War. George Orwell, 1984, where the blocs become like Warsaw Pact, NATO, outright antagonistic and ready to go to war with each other, massive nuclear weapons at a moment's notice. Got to, number one, prevent that, number one. Number two, to make sure that you have friends in all camps. For example, it could be an advantage for Turkey to have good relations with Russia, precisely because when the West wants to do a grain deal with Russia, Turkey can negotiate it. So if I've got you in the enemy camp, it's not a bad thing. because I can phone you up and say, hey, can you help me do a deal? If you don't have a Turkey, friends with Russia, who's going to negotiate the grain deal? These swing states can be a nuisance, but they can be useful to you as well. And then finally, as we go towards this multipolar world, we've got to find a few commonalities that bring us all together. Climate change is one, where we're all in the same boat. So let's forget our differences. Because we're all going to go down unless we deal with climate change. And the Chinese cooperate with the West very much on climate change, where there's a common interest. Fighting terrorism, with Russia, used to be that kind of thing in the past. More difficult today. There are these kind of, AI regulation. The coming back to the UK, sorry to give you such a long answer, but it's a very good question. But the Brits were really cock-a-hoop a few weeks ago because we had this summit on AI safety in the UK at Bletchley Park, and the Brits were going around saying the Chinese have turned up. We've got the Chinese to come to a summit with Kamala Harris, the US Vice President. Look, we can build those bridges, and AI could be an area where the Chinese also have been speaking a lot about the need for regulation and cooperation. So, so can't avoid the multipolar world, but it doesn't necessarily have to be dangerous if we can keep those three things in mind. Foreign fighters, a really good question. Well, in a way, as I've said, radicalization is the big threat at the moment, because a certain percentage of people will be radicalized on this. The Arab-Palestinian issue has always been a great radicalizer in the past. And what the US has to do, and the Europeans, is sort of go through this conflict without sort of coming across as the bully that's responsible for it all by the support of Israel, and then turn the attention of these groups on itself. We had 40,000 foreign fighters that went off to help ISIL during the years of the Caliphate. Many came from Belgium, as you well know, which had one of the pro capita highest percentages, but from many other countries as well, including the UK and so on. So there is a reservoir of these people who will be available. The places to get to are probably more difficult now. It was comparatively easy for a foreign fighter to go to Turkey. You just jumped on a plane, took a bus to the border, over into Syria, and within 24 hours, you were a foreign fighter. Here I am, Mum, look at me. But where they are today, Mali, Burkina Faso, Central African Republic, Southern Chad, that ain't so easy to get to. To go and support the great sort of cause. And so that may be one of the factors, that you may have lots of wannabes, but the ability to connect, ISIL Central doesn't exist anymore. So the ability to sort of phone up and next day you're there is going to be more difficult. So that may be something that Western intelligence services can play with. But yeah, I think a lot really are worried that if this conflict goes on, you will have a certain number who will be radicalised and want at least to do something. And of course, the big problem, finally, is that you don't need to be a foreign fighter any longer. A lot of these movements will say to you, no, don't come to us, it's too damn difficult. Just blow up something at home. Grab a knife, kill a policeman on London Bridge, or, hire a truck and plough into a few people. That's easy, that's doable, no plane tickets, no training's required. And that way helps the cause just as much as if you came to join us. So that I think the domestic aspect is something that intelligence services will worry about. Sorry for all those very long answers, but I was just trying to do credit to brilliant questions, really brilliant questions.
I understand that no more questions, and if Jamie, if I can start from this side of the room by maybe addressing the students and thanking all of you for participating and asking your questions. I hope you found it useful. Today's a bit of a special class, if I may say, with a very special guest. Second, next week I will continue the US foreign policy and EU external relations class, which we didn't finish, and I will also try to add something on, let's say, an important instrument on foreign policy on both sides of the Atlantic, which are sanctions, an instrument that is increasingly, or has been increasingly used in in foreign policy, and on which there is a good track record now of transatlantic cooperation. But here the most important thing is to thank Professor Shi. I think, if I may say on a personal note, I mean, you were so generous with your time, really. You're so generous in sharing your extraordinary experience, generous with your insight on a topic which is not that easy, and which, since the Second World War, has been described in history books as, yes, one flow of ongoing conflicts, and nothing much more, nothing much else. But so it's not easy to find or to present the background. You were generous also in answering the many questions. So thank you for that. I thought also that at one point, what you were saying about the continued need for bridge makers, and if I may add, peacemakers, bridge builders and peacemakers. I mean, I hope you will keep that in your head, but maybe one day you'll be asked yourself to be a bridge builder, whatever capacity you will find yourself. So, but Jamie, for all these reasons, thank you so much for what you've done here this afternoon. And as a token of our gratitude, I think that here behind me, yes, well hidden, well hidden, is our secret weapon. Again, a very small token of our sympathy and gratitude.
Yeah, but it plays to my greatest need.
It plays to your greatest need. So,
Thanks, thank you, everybody.
One week for thank you.
All right, I appreciate it.